everything that you've ever worked for is gone.
People in other countries, you're in a very different reality. Your currency going through hyperinflation. The person who's sitting here in the US watching your money evaporate. In other countries, you're seeing decimation. You're seeing your entire wealth and your family and your generations that have been saving. You're seeing all of that wiped out. You're not going to be able to move across the world with $1 billion worth of gold on your back, but you can move across the world with $1 billion worth of Bitcoin in your head. Where is the world going? Nico, thank you so much for coming on, man. This is going to be a really fun episode. You know, a lot of people, when they come on a Bitcoin podcast, the first question is, you know, how you got into Bitcoin. This one, we're going to start off a little bit differently. So I want to go back in time and let's imagine that you and I were best friends in high school. Back in high school, what were you like? What were you interested in? What was your mindset at that time before, you know, going down your career and eventually doing what you're doing today at Ego Death Capital?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I grew up in Southern California in Orange County, about 10 to 15 minutes inland from Laguna Beach. So very, very different climate to where I'm at now. I live in New York, slightly outside the city, was in the city for the better part of the last decade plus. And I would spend a lot of my time as like a kid outdoors. And I think like that translated to high school too. So I always liked to be like outdoors, very, very active. In high school, I was kind of like a nerd athlete. I played water polo, played basketball until I realized like I was not going to grow any higher than 5'10", and then just continued to play water polo. Swam because it was mandatory that if you were playing water polo, you were going to be swimming. Swimming is like playing tag with the wall, which is great if you're a kid in a swimming pool, but if you're doing it for thousands and thousands of yards, it gets boring pretty quick. And then I was a nerd in that, like, I loved school, loved studying, was always really interested in other people's careers. I think as like a young adult, and especially in high school, I always wanted to be like a step farther than where I was. So fascinated. I was the kid at 12 or 13 that was going to like college days to meet with the different universities that were there and find out about different other people's professions. The kid that at 17, instead of like just enjoying a summer going into senior year, was like, oh, I'll get an internship with like a local law firm and like find out more from there. I've tried to like tone that down a little bit, I think, as I've gotten older. But that was me, and it was fun. And I would find time a lot of the time to be outdoors. So if I could go surfing is like one of my favorite things to do. I'll still do that in New York. But I would do that in Southern California. So if that meant like surfing in Laguna Beach or going slightly farther south in San Clemente to T Street or Trestles, is always something that's like brought me a lot of peace, just being like connected with nature, which was really interesting to then move from Southern California to New York. You're living here, right outside of here now. It's a concrete jungle, not much of an outdoor jungle.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious what made you want to move from, because it sounds like you're a very outdoorsy type of guy, like to do a lot of activities. And that's one of the things that I noticed right away after moving to, as you mentioned, the concrete jungle. There's a lot more limitations in terms of being able to go and do activities outside of like boozy brunches and tech events.
Yeah. I joke with my wife that like everything in New York revolves around drinking or eating. So and required, like anything that you're going to do in the city requires you to spend money. It's not a bad thing, but it just is. It's a thing. And where I grew up, I could walk across from where my parents were. There was this park, and there's like hundreds of miles of trails like through the back of this canyon. And that's a great point. I think at 18, I was looking at 3 different schools. 2 of them were in California, and then one of them was NYU. And I felt like it would be a really big challenge for me, and that I would be placed as an 18-year-old in the city. And NYU doesn't really have a campus. They like a traditional college campus. There's kind of revolves around Washington Square Park, but they're one of the biggest private landowners in New York. So you're really just, you are in New York all the time. And I thought that it would be a really big challenge for me professionally, and a really big challenge personally. And I wanted to get out of my comfort zone and go after that. And I think that that's something that I've probably done throughout life, for good or bad.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Washington Square Park. Back when I was going through internships, my first internship was actually in New York, and I was staying at the NYU dorms that were right there by Washington Square Park. So I'd be walking through there every
Yeah,
single day
yeah,
on my way to work, and very, very fond memories. I also would, there are those chess players that are always there,
totally.
and
Yeah, they'll
I'm
kill you.
obsessed with chess. So when I
Yeah,
was younger, I'd play all the time, and I'd go and challenge them. Then they'd kick my ass in chess, and then I go about my day. But
yeah.
it was a lot of fun. A lot of
Did you
fun.
ever win?
I did win once. Yeah, I
That's
did.
that's a big accomplishment.
Yeah, I was. So the way that I play, I like to not play with time just because
Right.
I'm not
Agreed.
playing as often as those guys. So my thought process is, okay, they're going to be a lot quicker on it. So if I can play them in a non-time game, then I feel like I have a much better shot. So I got some guys to every single time I played timed, I lost. But
Right.
when I was able to play them where it was just a really long game, like a long, grueling game. But he blundered, and then I ended up being able to win it. So, yeah, that is
That's
one of my few accomplishments from that summer that I'm extremely proud of.
that I feel like that's like a fact that you take with you forever. Like that's one of those things in like a party game where you're like, I have won a game of chess against one of the like street players in New York City, and that's I think that other component of the time like just is so tough to deal with because they're playing all the time period, and then you have
Mhm.
what is it 2 or 4 minutes that they end up allowing you to have on the clock, and they move so quickly, and then by that time you end up losing because you've lost time and it just
Mhm.
screws with the ability to think. But what a cool accomplishment. That's fun.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot of fun. Sometimes I still play. After the Queen's Gambit came out, I got the app again because I had
Yeah.
just completely forgotten about chess pretty much since that summer. I hadn't been playing at all. And
Yep.
then when the show came out, I got obsessed with it and then got obsessed with chess again. And then now I have to not have the app on my phone because I'll spend too much time playing it just because it's such an addictive game. It's so fun.
It is fun. There's a couple spots off Thompson Street that you can actually play. And we play in college. I'm sure you would whoop my ass, but we should definitely play sometime.
Yeah, that would be fun. I hear Jack Mahlers is actually an incredible player too. He used to
Really?
compete very, very high level. Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I think he has an ELO like a rating above 2,000, which is a
Wow.
very, very solid rating
Yeah.
for chess
Yeah.
players. Yeah. So I
Amazing.
want to dive into
Love it.
Bitcoin with you now.
Let's do it.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
let's do it. So um, I'm actually really, really curious for the later part of this conversation where we're going to dive into some of your predictions and how you see the landscape. Because I feel like from in a bird's eye view, you're sitting in a very interesting position as a venture partner at Ego Death Capital. For everyone listening, that is, we're very lucky to be having this conversation, be able to get the insights from you because you're someone that, in a way, is going out into the unknown from an investment perspective and deciding where humanity's energy and investment capital is being put into. And the companies that are being backed in the space have the opportunity to go and make incredible impact on the industry and on the world at large. So, taking a step back, I'm curious as to what actually got you interested in Bitcoin. Are there any particular key defining moments or stories or things that come to mind that when you think back on your Bitcoin journey that you feel were really influential in the path that you've been on?
So there's a couple. I think that the first time that I came across Bitcoin, I was working in private equity, and I was it was there's these two dark marketplaces of the Silk Road and the Armory, and it just fascinated me from the standpoint that you could buy um, a bunch of drugs or any type of weapon and using this digital money. And at that time period, you had to send money to Japan in order to get it, and I never like crossed that chasm. But it was really fascinating to me that this entire marketplace had been set up. Um, I came back into it a little bit later in my PE journey because a lot of the stuff that we were doing in private equity was in emerging and frontier markets. So if we've looked at the traditional financial landscape over the last few years in those markets, it's really come to light to a lot of people, which wasn't really apparent for a bit. of how money can be used as a means of control, controlling the population, controlling the degree to which you're able to like earn and save. Um, and in a Western world, those things are not that apparent and have become really, really apparent to people over the COVID period, over the like different financial crises. They seem to come to light to certain people and they click in. But for me, dealing with these areas in call it like Western Africa or Latin America, and some of these projects, you're really on the front end of that because a lot of times with those projects, you have a U.S. dollar investment, and there's some type of conversion to call it like Ghanaian cedis or Nigerian naira that's happening, and you start to become acutely aware as to the stability of those different states and the financial access that those people have. So for me, this started to click in as to Bitcoin really afforded a way for people in those areas to have a means to save and to have money outside of the state that they lived in. And that was a really, really interesting thing. And one of the things that I remember talking to Jeff Booth, so one of the early like venture partners or one of the other partners, general partners at Ego Death Capital, with myself and Andy Pitt, is if you look at like Bitcoin's volatility and you take the volatility of like a Venezuela or like a Nigerian naira, um, people in those countries would be happy to have the volatility of a Bitcoin, uh, and that becomes like a really profound thing for them and in their life. And I think like that started to click into me. Um, and that made it like Bitcoin interesting from like an investment standpoint as a means of saving. Um, but the thing that really I would say over the last like couple years, 2 to 3 years, that really caught my attention was this shift from Bitcoin as a store of value to a hybrid network that had the ability to store information on top of it and to build applications on top of that. And that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you look at the different perspective that you get when you go global
Yeah,
versus just the Western perspective. Because I speak with a lot of people in the US about some of the things that you just mentioned, and you got a first row seat to being able to see, hey, people in other countries, you're in a very different reality if you're living in Venezuela and you have to worry about your currency going through hyperinflation than the person who's sitting here in the US and looking, prices really seem to have gone up quite a bit. This CPI number and this inflation
right,
is actually
right,
starting to affect how much money is in my bank account and how much you're spending on a monthly basis. So it's almost in one scenario in the US, a huge inconvenience. You're watching your money evaporate. But then in other countries, you're seeing decimation. You're seeing your entire wealth and your family and your generations that have been saving. You're seeing all of that wiped out. And it's a much bigger problem for you if you're in scenario two in Venezuela than it is if you're living here in the US.
agreed. Yeah, I think we're so fortunate to be able to be born living in the United States, even some of these other Western countries, for exactly the point that you just made. In that the difference being a slight inconvenience, you might be able to spend a little bit less money because it's a slow bleed, versus something where overnight there's bank runs or the state takes your money, and you're left with nothing, and everything that you've ever worked for is gone. Um, it's a very, very different scenario. And so the like Bitcoin solving that or giving people tools for that was really interesting. And then the updates in the past, call it couple years, of Bitcoin not only giving you this store of value, and I know we'll get into it more in a little bit, but starting to give you other tools that had been afforded to people in a Western world, but not offered to those in emerging economies is really a profound thing.
Yeah. And so actually diving into that next layer, that next frontier of Bitcoin. I think that you're one of the best people to speak with about this, because a lot of people like myself and other people who are deep in the industry, we're just looking at the headlines, the news, the announcements, and then you can dig a little bit deeper to find out about some companies. But this is really what takes up a lot of your, I would like to say, mental space or time in terms of figuring out where is the world going. And so shifting from the understanding that Bitcoin has value as a store value, as a way to escape a collapsing currency, to the application fronts and some of these companies building Bitcoin companies, what are some of those emerging trends or things that you're excited about being an investor, a venture investor within the Bitcoin ecosystem?
That's a great question. I think some of the building that we're seeing really early on is those initial financial tools that we have had, or the fundamental financial tools that we have had in a Western world for decades, and or for the better part of the last century. And you're starting to see those being built on top of Bitcoin to solve inefficiencies in a traditional financial market. And they're less apparent, like you went into, in a developed world, and more apparent in an emerging and frontier market. So something like a strike, where a strike Bitnob connection in Africa, where you have an average of around a 9% remittance cost to send money in between the countries, if you can even do it, and you have a dollar shortage a lot of times on the other side in Africa. If you're able to use Bitcoin as a rail in between those two individuals, let's say sending money from the United States to like a Nigeria in Africa, um, someone might not even on either end of that transaction understand that Bitcoin is in the middle of it, but it facilitates a more efficient and cheaper financial transaction. So that's an interesting technology. Um,
Yeah,
Fetty,
actually,
that
to
we
dive into that
yeah,
particular example, just to really illustrate it, could you give it as an example of, like, let's imagine that you're in a world without Strike, right? So Strike is one of these companies that is
yep.
leveraging Bitcoin to do exactly what you just talked about. But could you talk through what that world looks like for the person living in Nigeria if there's no Strike?
So if there's no strike, and you want to send a remittance payment, let's use the example of, I like using like a son in New Jersey and like a mom or a grandmother in Nigeria, because it typically, you have like the younger generation has moved on to a more developed market, and then they send money back, and that in these developing markets, it makes up a fair amount of the money in those developing markets is the money that's actually sent back. So what happens is the individual within, call it New Jersey, use New Jersey as an example, would go to their bank, or would go to a money transmitter like a Western Union, and they would take $1,000. The $1,000 would go from their like bank in the U.S. to the central bank, and then the banks from the U.S. to potentially an intermediary bank, and then to a Nigerian bank, and then like getting deposited back in Nigeria. Um, and what ends up happening is the amount of payment hops that's in between those creates a huge inefficiency within the transaction. Um, and might not even make it possible, depending on the amount of dollars that are in circulation in between those different banks, because now we're having to convert dollars to naira. What happens in the the strike example, which is really interesting, is that you strike is facilitating dollars to Bitcoin, and then on the other side, Bitcoin to Naira. And that little nuance allows you to make that transaction in, call it, a minute, instead of having to worry about doing it potentially over weeks, if it's possible to do it at all. And the fee with it is so much lower than that average of 9%. I'm not quite sure, because it's a little stale on like the last time I looked at what Jack Mullers and Bernard at Bitnob were doing with this, but I think it's like around like 3 or 4%, which is closer to the target that the African continent wants to get to by like the 2030s, mid 2030s, I believe. Um, and that's just the beginning. So like that's a really interesting technology. I think that remittances is a front and center multi-billion-dollar industry. We can look at something like a Fedi that I think is like pretty interesting in that they're creating a community custody model. And through that community custody model, you'll be able to transact with in your communities or across different communities. And so you could have the same example as um, like the Strike and Bitnob example that's using Bitcoin, but in the Fedi example, you're using Bitcoin and you're using the Lightning Network. They're both using the Lightning Network. And the fees could be even lower than what we've been able to do beforehand. And the transaction could be more instantaneous. So those type of technologies that are really starting to lay the foundational tools for some of the call it like transacting or base financial technologies of the future for a global marketplace or global trade are really, really interesting.
Yeah, I have this conversation with our president at Sazmining, Kent, fairly often because we still are in this weird middle layer where you're dealing with banks as well as dealing with the Bitcoin network.
Yeah.
And I have never heard in my entire time in this industry someone say, "Oh, I love the banks. They're just so great. They just
Yeah.
always work, never run into any issues." And in that first example you gave, I think that you laid it out beautifully, which is it's very inconvenient if you want to go and send money to a family member in a different country in a different currency if you're doing anything except using Bitcoin. You're dealing with very high fees, you're dealing with a lot of middlemen and intermediaries, and it's just taking a lot of time versus leveraging better technology, aka Bitcoin, and these Bitcoin based services. You just have a much better experience. The money gets there. You're not wasting a ton of time to send the transaction, and you're not having a lot of your money taken away from where it's trying to go.
Yeah.
On the Fedi example, I am curious because this is something that, despite having, I believe this is the third time it's been explained to me, it's still kind of murky in my head on how exactly it operates. So maybe what tends to help me is if you could walk through an example of someone who's using it in the early stages with the technology and how it's being
Yeah.
leveraged. I think that that would be really useful.
So one of the initial things that Fedi realized, and Obi in particular, was that self custody is really hard. Like self custody is the gold standard, and we come at it from a Western viewpoint of everybody should have their hardware devices. They should be storing their keys. Their keys should be in multiple places. You should have the responsibility of that. You should multi-sig setup. Um, when you go, so like I went to the African Bitcoin conference in Ghana, and when you go into any of these developed markets, you start talking about that, and it just goes right over their head. It's too complex. It's too hard. It's they don't have enough money. If you think about like how much some of these hardware devices, and some of them can be like quite inexpensive um, and great to use. Like CoinKite makes incredible hardware devices, and they're relatively inexpensive. But the for someone that has caught like tens of dollars in like their pocket or maybe in all of their possession, like that's just not possible. It's not a possible solution, and it's too much friction to allow someone to create, call it a circular economy using Bitcoin. So there's this big like aha moment of okay, so first party custody, you self custodying something is very, very hard and you're going to lose a lot of people from there. Um, and truly custodian models have shown or been proven to be like prone to I don't even know what you want to call it, but just fraud, scams. You're placing an incredible amount of trust in people that you probably shouldn't. In that there's a hybrid in between of this collaborative custody. So what Fedi does is it takes the most trusted people probably in your networks, and I like to use it as like a community banking environment. So in its simplest form, you're creating a community bank between yourself and your most trusted um, friends, family members. So you could say like my wife, my brother-in-law, my sister. The tech savvy person is going to set up the situation, but then set up the federation. But then together we can custody one another's Bitcoin or funds. And in that way, the parties that are not very tech savvy don't have to memorize their seed phrases. They don't have to worry about these intense custody setups. They don't have to have their hardware devices. They can be onboarded in a matter of seconds, instead of it taking a long period of time. And then the environments that you're creating through these community banks, allow for circular economies where you can transact in between the federation that you have, the community bank that you have, or you could transact between other federations, um, using the Lightning Network, allowing for interoperability. Um, it's really fascinating technology because you're trusting the individuals that you trust the most in your life with custody, and creating this environment for not only your money, but potentially your data down the road. Like if you're using it for a chat or for some other applications. Um, that's it on a base level. And if we think about the global south, um, something as simple as that, and there's a lot of like, I would say more technical aspects to it, but for the stamp, the for simplicity's sake of staying pretty high level, something as simple as that, a collaborative custody model that allows for interoperability between transactions, um, and recovery through that collaborative custody could be a quite profound solution for people in this global south market.
I finally understand it now. And I've actually been through that whole that whole challenge of the self custody piece, because I feel like every single person who really starts diving down and trying to embody a lot of the ethos behind Bitcoin at some point is going and figuring out, okay, well, this is the difference between a hot wallet, a cold wallet. This is how I need to manage my Bitcoin, my crypto, my wealth if I want to self custody it. And it's a very different paradigm in regards to the traditional system where you trust a bank. You're taking full responsibility. You're taking responsibility for making sure that you're protecting your seed phrase, you're protecting your hardware, and then it just gets very complex very quickly when you go to multi-sigs and you don't want a single point of failure, and how to actually manage the technical side of that. I agree in the sense that I do not believe that every single person should be going and self-custodying their funds, because it's very difficult. And a lot of times you're going to have people mess up. They might lose the seed phrase. It might get compromised. They might be taking screenshots and then that gets compromised. And it's a very difficult challenge to overcome. So I definitely firsthand can attest to the benefit of having a model like that. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it rolls out in those communities that it resonates with. I mean, even with like a Western world of probably the early adopters of like Bitcoin, like there's, what is the percentage of like Bitcoin that's probably lost? It's
Oh, too high.
yeah. So there's like there's even that, if we could say that like even in a Western world where you're like more sophisticated probably with some of these things, and the money's there to make it make sense for you to have the hardware devices, like even then like people are losing, they're losing their seed phrases, they're losing their devices. Like it is not easy, and that's why other solutions, even particularly in a Western world, have emerged of like custodian solutions, where you're starting to trust certain custodians, or a multi-sig setup with certain custodians, um, and people are trusting those. And because like self custody is very hard.
Yeah, I feel like everyone has, especially if you've been in the industry, you've run into someone and had a conversation where they said, "Oh, I had all this Bitcoin, or I
Right,
lost this Bitcoin, I lost this
right,
hardware." Well, actually, funny side story. So there's this guy that I used to go to school with, and very, very nice guy. I hadn't seen him in a while, and then I run into him at a party, and uh, he had been seeing a lot of how I'd gotten really deep into Bitcoin and was building Sazmining, and he says, "Man, I had so much Bitcoin back in the day," because he was using it in the
right.
very early days of the Silk Road, and he was using it to buy drugs.
There you
and
go.
weed. And what he was doing was he was buying all of this weed in Bitcoin. And then once he got the weed, he would sell the weed. And so he said, man, the amount of Bitcoin that I bought and then
Yeah.
like used to buy weed and then like sold the weed. He's like, if I just bought and held all this Bitcoin, I'd have like many, many, many millions of dollars. But
Right.
instead, he
Right.
was just doing all this work in between to like send out the Bitcoin to get weed and then sell the weed. I'm like, dude, that if there's ever a story to learn about what it is that you are owning and to hold Bitcoin, that was one that I felt bad for the guy, but it's still one of those things where even despite that experience, he still hasn't dove into Bitcoin. He just kind of looks at it like, oh, I missed the boat. Uh,
Right.
and those are the people where if you just take the time to really understand what's going on here in the paradigm shift. I told him, I said, look, I would highly recommend paying attention because even though you think it's late, it's still so early. We're still in the first innings of this. You're going to look back at this exact conversation as another opportunity to dive in and actually learn about it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the shock for people outside of the industry is they look at Bitcoin's price and and they view Bitcoin's price as an indicator of like one thing that they miss getting access to because it has gone from nothing to around $30,000 today and close to $70,000 last year. Um, and they're like, well, there's so many of these other things that have been created on like Bitcoin's coattails, and I might like try and jump on one of those instead of understanding the problem that Bitcoin is looking to solve or is solving and why everything else is noise. And I think that like as soon as that clicks over, then it's exactly what you said. It's this is a paradigm shifting technology. And the fact that we're at 30,000 like doesn't it in some ways it matters and in most ways it doesn't matter. Um, as long as the network continues to be highly decentralized, as long as the network exists, as long as technology is being built on top of the network, like Bitcoin's not going anywhere. And if the inflationary monetary policy continues to exist, which it has to continue to exist in a traditional financial world, then Bitcoin's price over time will continue to get like become more and more valuable. I think it's hard or not really worth time to spend trying to predict where that price is going to be at a certain time period. But just understanding the like what I just said, I think is the most important thing. And being like you were talking about, being along for the ride.
It's so great to hear this on the podcast because I don't think I've actually heard a guest in all my conversations outline that exact philosophy the way that you just did, which is, I think, the reason why I personally have so much conviction. If someone were to ask me the question of how do you have so much conviction of where Bitcoin's going, I fall into the exact same boat where I think that the price anywhere short-term predictions are more of noise, and that's what other people are valuing it on. But when you speak with people who understand all the big dynamics and levers at play, every single person coming from that paradigm is more focused on the long term. And what really underpins my belief in the long term is what you just mentioned, where you have the traditional monetary system where all currencies over time trend towards zero. They all get printed into oblivion. So if you just play this same pattern out, the pattern that's happened for all of human history, thousands of currencies, if you just assume that it's not suddenly going to stop, then more and more of that value is going to get printed and eventually sucked into the Bitcoin ecosystem over time. Just through that example that we talked about earlier, if you're living in a country and your currency is going through hyperinflation, are you just going to sit there and take it? Or are you going to try and find a way to get out of that and into something where you can protect your wealth, whether it be the dollar, which is what many people would likely say, but you're probably not going to have too much trust to fiat currencies once you understand how they operate. And then you're going to opt for an ecosystem like Bitcoin. That's my thesis in a nutshell.
Yeah, and that's where we're at. So like I think that the like sitting in the seat that I get to sit in, and being a venture capitalist in this industry, like venture capital funds were founded to back companies super early on in their life cycles and to watch them grow over like a 10 to 12 year period and to continue to back the winners that are in there. And a lot of times we see that. I think Bitcoin, investing in Bitcoin is the perfect place to be from a venture capital standpoint in the way that we just outlined. It's short-term price predictions are just noise. That's all they are. But if we look at a long-term, um, over the long term, we can make a pretty, I would say, like confident bet as to where things are going. And based on that, you can also start to make other predictions of different other companies um, that are going to benefit from the trend that's happening on Bitcoin. Not the trend, but the movement. Trend would be short term, and in that way, we start to see like these companies that on a day to day basis, if you were looking at it like one day to the next, might not seem like a tremendous amount of change. But if you step back and you look at it on an annual basis or even on 6 months, like these are huge, huge amounts of change that are happening. It's almost like a parent looking at a child. If you're going to look at the child early on, um, when I have a 2 year old and a 5 year old. If I were to look at them on a day to day basis, there's probably very little change that I'd be able to observe. But if I were to go away and then come back 6 months later, the amount of change that would have happened would be like incredible. And that's what we're seeing within Bitcoin is that you're not going to see these overnight explosions that the world in this like fake DeFi system have grown accustomed to, because that's not how you build sustainable, um, real solutions. What we're going to see is we're going to see real building, real companies that have high real world utility and low speculation over the long term. And those are going to be built on Bitcoin.
Well put. I really like that analogy with, I'm gonna take that and start using that actually. Like when you look at your kid on a day to day basis. Yeah, when any type of change, um, when you look at it under a microscope, it's very hard to see the change. But when you take a step back and you look at it, you're like, oh my god, like what's happened here? This is crazy. Um, I am curious, going back to what you had mentioned earlier, this idea of this idea behind your philosophy of what underpins Bitcoin. Um, I think that from your perspective, you touched on you're driving the puck and trying to back the winners and trying to create real utility. How is it that you're evaluating and deciding where that utility is actually within the industry? Because a lot of times there is a lot of noise. You have a lot of these DeFi projects. You have a lot of people paying attention to price more as a signal instead of actual building actual things that are going to provide value within the economy. So from your position, when you're looking at these projects, how are you actually deciding, hey, this is more noise, this is a signal versus, hey, there's something here that we should pay attention to that is actually going to maintain and hold value within society?
So it's a great question. I think a lot of the stuff that's being built right now that I get and the team gets incredibly excited about is the stuff that potentially you wouldn't even know that Bitcoin's rail is being utilized. So there are a lot of projects within Bitcoin right now that will talk about going after market share in Bitcoin. And Bitcoin's as a like ecosystem that you're looking to play in is still relatively small. Um, if you develop profound technology that can be utilized initially probably in Bitcoin, but then adopted in a broader world, um, whether or not they understand that Bitcoin is the underlying technology underneath that. It's like I flick a white light switch on. I don't have to understand electricity to know like the light went on, or to understand the value that it gives to me if I'm in a dark room. Bitcoin can serve another type of purpose. So when we're starting to look at these companies, you look at companies that, or we look at companies that can have an impact in Bitcoin's ecosystem today, but will have are solving an inefficiency in the world that we live in, the broader world that we live in, um, utilizing Bitcoin. So one of the companies that comes like top of mind to that is Sonoda. So you have these individuals that have decades of experience in an energy background and looked at the current payment infrastructure in the traditional energy world and saw how inefficient it was from the standpoint of you utilize energy today and you're billed for it 30 days after that, and then the bill is paid probably 30 days after that. So we have a cash lag, there's a default risk, there's a carry cost to that money. And all of this is done because the traditional fiat rails require this inefficiency. And by utilizing Bitcoin, you can solve that inefficiency. So immediately you're we were brought to that project has real world utility, or the potential to have real world utility utilizing Bitcoin. I think that's how we separate signal from noise in that standpoint, or one of the ways that we go about doing that. There is a tremendous amount of noise. We're probably looking at from projects that we look at versus projects that we invest, we're probably at around a 2% rate of investing versus projects that we're observing. Um, and even that, the environment of venture is just incredibly high risk. Um, but the technology has the potential to be quite profound for not only inside of Bitcoin and Bitcoin's probably future price, but for the world at large.
It's funny that that's the example that you gave from a company standpoint, because I was just in DC for the event being put on by BPI, and I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, but I know
Austin.
the guy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I also met him at Bitcoin 2022 for the first time, and he's also been in touch with Kent, and yeah, he's an awesome guy. I think solving a real world problem. We're trying to see ways in which we can collaborate here at Sazmining. It is actually a good bridge for the next topic that I want to cover with you. Outside of just the technology standpoint, what you're doing is you're evaluating teams at a very early stage. So you can have the best idea in the entire world, but if you're not able to execute on that vision or bring it to fruition, then nothing's going to actually happen. Nothing's going to get built. And so a lot of your job seems to me to be, okay, well, is the technology there? Is the world moving in that type of direction where this is very valuable? And are these the guys that are going to build it? And so from your perspective, having seen many entrepreneurs, having an experience vetting and investing in these early stage companies, what are the key common characteristics and traits that you believe make these entrepreneurs, the successful entrepreneurs, successful? What is the common thing that they have that many of the people who failed don't?
Yeah, so this is great. This is exactly how we look at projects at the beginning. So we evaluate them from a project standpoint. So you're evaluating the idea, what you're getting behind to qualify across a number of different metrics. And then you're evaluating the individuals and ideally the team. Um, there's some great stats on solopreneurs. So if you're founding a company by yourself, and how much more beneficial it is to have a team. So if you're evaluating that team, and we weight these things. Um, and it's a great thing that you asked on it. So we evaluate them the same way that the standards that we hold the fund to. So like on our fund website, we have like pillars for the fund, and then we have the principles of the fund. So things like passion, integrity, grit are going to be things that we're going to be looking for to see from that entrepreneur. And we're grading them against all of those different metrics to see how they stand up. As you correctly pointed out, it's a lot of times that captain of the ship with early stage venture that is incredibly important. And the idea is one thing, but the ability to be an entrepreneur in a tough economy with a lot of bumps, to go through the ups and downs of what that means is incredibly important. The other standpoint too is having this like loyalty, trust, and like clear communication with those entrepreneurs or portfolio companies and us as the fund, as we're looking at a long-term relationship. Like venture investing from the standpoint of when a company is founded until what's called a liquidity event. So sale, merger, acquisition, IPO, any of those type of things, um, those tend to take 6 to 9 years from a company being founded. So at the stage that we're investing from a pre-seed to seed level, that means that we're going to be partners with that entrepreneur for a long period of time. And if we can't trust one another, if we can't communicate correctly or effectively, then it's going to be a fraught partnership. And so we're evaluating all these things pretty early on. And the same way, and I tell other founders to do this, you should be evaluating funds that same way, as it's not a one-way street. It's incredibly important for founders to ask questions of the funds, to evaluate them the same way that the funds are probably evaluating you. In that the funds want to find investable projects, and when they find those investable projects, companies should want helpful, smart capital to be partners with them.
100%. It's funny because, I haven't ever been in the venture seat of things. I've been on in the entrepreneur seat of things, but going through that journey, you just learn a lot. And I think that that's one piece where, especially earlier on in my journey as an entrepreneur, you never really thought about. You just think, okay, well, you're trying to bring this company to fruition. You're trying to make this thing happen. And money is something that is critical for making that happen, because there are all these things that need to happen that money can make happen along the way. And the mindset is really shifted for me personally, just seeing the value that a good investor can bring to the table. Just like how when you bring on a stellar employee, for example, that stellar employee can get so much done and bring so much value to your organization. A good, intelligent, well-connected investor can definitely do the same. It's not like they're going to be putting in the times that an executive at your company is, but they can open doors for you. They can be a great confidant and person to consult with when you have major decisions. And everyone knows that there are a handful of key decisions that you're going to be making that you don't know the right answer. You don't know which path is the right one. And it helps to have very informed, seasoned investors around you when you're making those tough calls.
And I would, if we take the example, so I've been an entrepreneur. I own another business that I've never taken money for. I've founded it, funded it myself, and we've grown it very effectively that way. And then the current model, right, that we have this in Ego Death Capital, we have to take investment money, right? So we are dealing with a ton of investors, and one of the things that we're evaluating in the same way that anybody else raising money or that has raised money should be evaluating is the vision aligned with those investors? Is the time frame that you're looking to build this business aligned with their expectations? If not, then you're probably setting yourself up for some friction that's going to take you away from building and accomplishing the mission that you set out to accomplish. I think one of the best ways to do it as a founder is to ask for references from those funds. So if the fund is relatively new, it's hard because there's not a lot of experience with it. If the fund is look at us. It's been just about a year, but there's a number of projects that if someone wanted to, they could ask for references from those other founders. They could ask for references from the investors. And this can be quite informative for any entrepreneur to understand like what kind of partner are they getting in bed with. Same thing when you're hiring the employee. I used to tell we'd have these interns like back in the day, different other company, that would be coming out of these great schools, coming out of Columbia, Wharton, Harvard, and incredibly qualified, like 22-year-old candidates. And there's this nervous energy about them because it's their first like interview cycle. remember one of the conversations that we had was the interviewer wants you to be the person as much as you potentially want the job. And now, if you viewed it from that mindset, you're just trying to see if the relationship is going to work. So stop thinking about it as like an interview and start thinking about it as like we're getting to know one another. And if this works, then it's going to be beneficial for everybody. And that same type of mindset, if it's taken into the way that people are raising capital or deploying capital even, it is going to be so much more helpful for the companies long term.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. It's something that has actually shifted. I mean, I haven't done it from the investment side, but I've done it a lot from the recruiting side. And it's been interesting to see how, at least my personal lens from a recruitment side has shifted, where in the very early days, it was much more of a, we're looking to hire for this type of role. We're looking to do X, Y, and Z. We found someone who can do it, and then it'll improve the bottom line by 3 times as much. So it's worth it. Let's do it. Versus the mindset more now, which is, in a startup, you want to find superstars. And so you want to find the best people and really not just find someone who can get the job done, but someone who goes above and beyond. And so rather than just settling for someone who meets the basic qualifications for something, you want to find that 10x, 100x employee that, hey, if we can get them on board, if we can get them on this journey with us and on this mission, the amount of the amount that we can get done as a team just skyrocketed. So it's not linear, it's more an exponential way of thinking. But in order to do that, it's very difficult because you have to kind of know what they're like. And that inevitably involves reference checks. You want the references to say, oh my God, I can't believe that you're getting this guy. He's incredible. And then you're digging around, you're trying to ask questions like, okay, well, I mean, if you're giving someone as a reference, they're probably not gonna say bad things right off the bat. So you kind of have to do some digging, like, aside from strengths, we like to figure out who, like the best way to support this person to make sure that they can succeed. What's the type of person that they work best with that can fill the slots, the things that they don't like to do. And then I give an example of myself, just like my strengths and then my weaknesses. Like, I'm not good with admin. I'll say it right here. Mark my words. If you ask Ken, Patrick, any of the guys I work with, they will say, okay, Will is the worst when it comes to HR admin stuff. So just don't put it in his plate. It won't get done. But then you give that example and then you can kind of dig and figure out, okay, well, this person's great in these things, but this is the thing that they're not great with, which could be totally fine. Like, it's not like they need to do that if someone else can do it. But it's interesting, these little insights that you don't really think. I mean, that key insight took me being an entrepreneur for about 6 years to figure out. And up until that point, it's like every single year along the journey, you're an entrepreneur, you learn different lessons.
Totally.
I mean, what are some of the key, I just gave one on the hiring side, but are there any, it could also be on the venture side, but what's like a key lesson, something that on your journey, it took you a while to learn. And if you could go back years and talk to yourself early on, just tell yourself, hey, this is something that you should know and that you should incorporate earlier.
I think your example of like the exponential growth with other people is one of the biggest things. So as a young, like you coming out of college and you're like, I can do everything. Or you because at this point, if you've been like pretty smart, you're probably the person that's like driving all the group projects. You don't trust anybody else to do this. What you realize is what you forget to realize is the thing that I think you correctly pointed out is that like 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2, it equals 3. And like Dalio points this out, and the you being able to do exponentially more with like great people within your organization. So that's one. 2 is blind spot awareness. So you're not good at admin. There are people on my team that are much better writers than I am. There are people on my team that are much better at taking incredibly dense, complex information sets and distilling them down into something that you can synthesize and make decisions off of. Lynn and Preston crush this, and I could not do that. There are people on my team that have better foresight as to the future. Jeff Booth, I think, has this incredible just vision. Andy Pitt is able to create a due diligence like flow better than I could. By having this blind spot awareness, we're able to then augment things that I'm not the best at and put people in that place to take over those things, and the team is just stronger. What I think that happens, especially when you're young, because I would do this, is that question that you're asking for the standpoint of like, well, what are the weaknesses is what you're trying to get out. A good company should be asking that question not to understand whether to disqualify the candidate, because at that point when you're asking the question, the candidate should already be probably pretty highly qualified. You should be asking the question in the same way you should ask it of yourself, in order for the best way to support that candidate so that you can get the most productivity out of them. And so as like an entrepreneur or as an employee, this is one of those ways that um, I don't want to call it asking for help, but the awareness of your blind spots and what you're not particularly good at, and getting help from others that are better suited in those areas will just improve productivity.
I know that we're against make like putting set price predictions within certain timeframes, but just because it's something that people are always going to ask, and people will be upset if I don't ask, I'll give you free reign in order to make some type of prediction of, you know, based on a timing or based on a target or just generally where you see this going. How do you look at Bitcoin from a price perspective?
So we don't make a price prediction as like a team, but what we do is look at like the total value of the global financial industry. And so that being around $19 trillion, we think that a large, like there's an argument to be said that from a global standpoint, a large proportion of that could shift over to Bitcoin. And from that, you can make your price assumption as to what that means. But that's it could be an incredibly large number.
Yeah. That I like the way that you laid that out though, because I think that when you think about this and when you understand all these other aspects of Bitcoin, you really do realize that there's a much larger addressable market out there of value that could go into Bitcoin than what a lot of people are looking at it as today. An example I give a lot of the time is, the taxi market, where if you were trying to put a value on Uber or a ride sharing business, the total addressable market was much larger than the actual true total addressable market for Uber or Lyft, because people didn't realize that it's opening up other larger markets. And with Bitcoin, a lot of people look at the store of value, a more short-term type of comparison for Bitcoin, which is the market cap of gold. But I
Right.
don't think people have truly made that full paradigm shift that you're talking about in terms of the total addressable market not being that of just gold, but that total addressable market being what you mentioned in the 19
The
trillion.
global financial industry. Yeah. So we see
Yeah.
that because like if it was just gold, then gold is a store of value, and gold is a actually pretty terrible means of transacting. It's pretty heavy. It requires like armed guards if you have a lot of it, probably a custodian to store it. Um, there is a very cool, as a quick aside, Valcambi bar. So out of the Swiss, it looks like if you just Google like Hershey's chocolate Valcambi bar, it looks like a Hershey's bar, but it's these little pieces of gold that you could like break off or store in your safe. Um, but yeah, we see it more as like a if global finance could shift to Bitcoin. Um, and there's not a reason why over the long term that's not possible.
I like that. I like that approach. Um, it's something where it's funny. It's like, that those times where you have a belief, but it can be hard to articulate how exactly those buckets break out. If you were to try and go one step further into how your why or how you have that conviction of why Bitcoin's market cap is larger than, or total addressable market, Bitcoin's total addressable market is larger than the current paradigm that people who are comparing it to gold have. How would you try and explain your conviction as to why we shouldn't be comparing it to just gold. We should be comparing it to something much larger.
I mean, let's go back to our initial example of like taking, or one of our earlier examples of sending a remittance from New Jersey to Nigeria. Like, you can't do that with gold. You can't send, you could send gold, but I could walk you through the steps to send gold. It's just even more inefficient. It might cost you less than the 9% spread on US dollars, but it's going to cost you more in time and inefficiency. Like, so gold mining the other way. You need to have Brinks or some other type of security firm that's loading that gold, probably bringing it from the mine, assaying it, refining it potentially in country, or flying that secured to somewhere else like the United States, then bringing it to a refinery, and having that transaction like just doesn't work. And so there's, if we're talking about Bitcoin, and this is where like Bitcoin starts to be pretty special. In order for Bitcoin adoption to reach this like hyper Bitcoinization, Bitcoin has to solve inefficiencies in a traditional financial market without potentially the majority of people realizing they're using Bitcoin. So Bitcoin initially sitting in between. So before Bitcoin has this, is adopted by everybody and everybody's comfortable with Bitcoin, Bitcoin as a technology, Bitcoin as a way to transact, Bitcoin as a medium of exchange will sit between transactions and people will not even realize they're using Bitcoin. You can't do that with gold. So we're talking about fractured global trade. We're talking about fractured remittances. In addition to the use cases that you would have for gold of like a store of value, as a savings instrument. So that's like just based on that, like Bitcoin's value is in my mind like much greater than gold's value.
That's a really good example. Yeah, it would be very difficult for you to escape from the Ukraine with $10 million worth of gold. I don't think
You can't do it.
you'd get out of the country. Yeah. That's one of the big things that a lot of people saw firsthand with everything happening with COVID and what happened with a lot of the oligarchs in Russia. I think that was a very clear example of, hey, you might think that you own hundreds of millions of dollars in all these assets, but if you can't guard it, if you can't protect it, if you can't protect your yacht, then it's not yours. It can be easily commandeered. And that's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. It just, the cost of actually protecting your property and your value has just been absolutely erased. It's like you're not going to be able to move across the world with $1 billion worth of gold on your back, but you can move across the world with $1 billion worth of Bitcoin in your head, if you know the seed phrase.
Right. Agreed.
Awesome. So I got some final questions for you, but before we dive into them, I love what you're doing at Ego Death Capital. I want to do whatever I can to support your work. So for everyone listening out there who resonates with a lot of the things that you've been talking about in this conversation, could you share how people can connect with the company and how they might be able to support what it is that you guys are working on?
Yeah, if you guys are building any projects on top of Bitcoin, or if you're looking to get connected in the industry, if you're looking to just network, we have a form submission on the website that you can just jump in on. We love connecting inside of Bitcoin. We love connecting people to other people. We love looking and evaluating projects. Of course, it's the mainstay of the business. Feel free to drop a line. We get back in touch with everybody. We don't ignore anybody, which I think is probably different than other than venture capital at large. And looking forward to connecting. You can also connect with us across on Twitter, through Ego Death Capital's handle, or Jeff, Andy, or myself, Preston, Lynn. Love to get in touch. We'll also be Jeff, Preston, and Lynn are at MicroStrategy right now, and then the whole team will be at Bitcoin Miami in a couple weeks.
Yeah, you guys got a great team. Really incredible, well-rounded team. Love your guys' vision and love what you're doing for the industry. So final question. I've been asking people on other podcasts. Uh, I've been asking, who do you think changes their mind first on Bitcoin, Peter Schiff or Warren Buffett? But because I've asked that a couple of times, I'm going to ask a slightly different version of the question. So I'm going to take Warren Buffett out of the equation. I'm going to focus on Peter Schiff because this is a guy that has known about Bitcoin longer than almost anyone. He's understood so many of the key principles and philosophies of why Bitcoin is valuable. And he's applied all those to gold, but he seems to be missing something very, very important when it comes to Bitcoin. And so I'm going to ask you to make a prediction on Peter Schiff here. If there's a betting market for this, I don't know if you can bet on this, but if there was a betting market and you're putting down money on the year that Peter Schiff finally sees the light and sees that Bitcoin does have value, it's not worthless, what year are you betting on?
Publicly? Like
Yes,
publicly,
yes, yes.
he admits it publicly.
Publicly. Yeah, and
I'll
when he
take
admits it publicly.
the other side of whatever year you want to take. I think this guy dies before he. At this point, it's like you're old, you're salty. He's taking it to his grave. He may
Yeah,
privately have something else. I have no intelligence or really any line of connection of anybody that would have had a private conversation with him. I would love to like get that at some point. As there are a number of people that their public versus private persona that we were able to get some intelligence on is different. But I think he goes to his grave. I think at
yeah.
this point you have to like this is part of his persona. I mean, it's like one of the marketing things too. We're talking about him. He gets a lot of attention on Twitter from it. I'm sure it's fun for him. Uh, yeah, I think he dies before that
it,
happens.
it's funny. So someone else gave a similar answer, but they said it about Warren Buffett. So they said that Warren's he's gonna pass before he changes his
Oh
mind on
yeah,
Bitcoin.
definitely Warren.
With Peter though, it's funny to think about because imagine I personally think that we're going to a Bitcoin future faster than many Bitcoiners probably do. And so it'll be funny if we're there in 10, 15 years and it's just everyone's there and talking about it. And then Peter's the one dude left on the planet who's just refusing to interact with Bitcoin.
Shilling gold. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's crazy to think about. But anyway, Nico, man, thank you so much for coming on to this episode. This has been so much fun. We're going to have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the Sazmining team. Really, really appreciate it. It's a fun conversation. Great way to get up.
As our journey comes to a close, make sure to stay connected with Sazmining for exclusive news and amazing offers. And we'd appreciate your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel to keep this content coming. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you in the next episode.